So can you explain to me why ATAGI and the HPCC were reluctant or did not give advice for home use of rapid antigen testing until such a late stage?
Senator John Skerritt, Deputy Secretary, Department of Health and Head of TGA. It was actually TGA's advice, although AHPPC was an input to the public health guidance on why it wasn't appropriate for Australia, say in April or even in May, June last year to have widespread home use rapid antigen testing. And the reason why it was quite inappropriate, in fact dangerous, had we had home use rapid antigen testing in early and mid 2021 is that half of them, maybe more, would have given the wrong answer. And so you would have had people with false positives, and in many, you also would have missed a significant number of infections. And this was at a time when we didn't, because in early 2021, it's only now a year since, less than a year still, since we've had the vaccine going into people's arms. We were still on that curve of getting the population vaccinated, and we're also in a world where we were individually contact tracing. And when you have a low prevalence of cases in the community, if it's only 1% of those who are being tested who are positive, you have 50, 60, 70% of results from rapid antigen tests just plain wrong. False positives and a few false negatives. In the world we have now, where sadly the proportion of people who are infected with COVID is much higher, there are statistical reasons why the reliability of rapid antigen tests is much higher. So that's why they were quite appropriate for New York in April 2021, but totally inappropriate for Australia in April, May, June 2021. The advice on the rapid antigen test went out actually in September last year. There were 13 approvals during October, and from 1 November 2021, where we did have a reasonably high, very high, as the Minister has said, vaccination rate in Australia, where contact tracing processes in many of the eastern states in particular had changed, and where we were integrating rapid antigen tests and self-testing with PCR testing, for example, recommending that symptomatic people and immediate family contacts of symptomatic people go to public health units for PCR testing, we had that framework in place. But this has been portrayed as some, the regulator was asleep or lazy or something like that. No, it was deliberate, because it would have been dangerous had we had 50, 60, 70% of false positive results from COVID testing in Australia 12 or even 9 months ago.
And I think it was Senator Lambie who earlier quoted you as saying, Mr. Skerritt, that you hadn't approved any rapid antigen tests because you were waiting for a political signal.
Not the word political.
Is she words in your mouth, or what was your actual position? So
the word I used was a signal from government, because the advice to government comes from AHP, I get into the acronym soup, I'm sorry, into AHPPC, which are all the state and territory chief health officers chaired by the chief medical officer, and they were having input from the diagnostics, the testing experts, such as the cDNA, such as the Public Health Laboratories Network and so forth. And so they were very aware of this problem, that 50% or more of the results would be garbage if we went into self-testing at a stage where we had very low disease prevalence and were wanting to do individual contact and individual venue tracing. And so they are advisors to government. So in that sense, it was a signal from government, but it was, as always throughout the pandemic, based on the best health advice to government.
It's Professor Paul Kelly here, the Chief Medical Officer. So just to add to Professor Skerritt's comments there. So as Professor Skerritt has mentioned, there's a number of advisory groups to either to me as Chief Medical Officer or to the Minister for Health, or indeed through to National Cabinet in terms of the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee that are involved with these types of decisions. It's not an easy decision. And as Professor Skerritt has mentioned, there are two technical groups that advise the AHPPC. One is the Public Health Laboratory Network, the other one the Communicable Diseases Network of Australia. And they have made 4 revisions to their advice in relation to rapid antigen tests. The first was on the 9th of October 2020. That was the initial document, and as Professor Skerritt mentioned, there was a consensus by those technical advisory groups that in the context that Australia was in at that time of low community transmission, rapid antigen tests were not the best way of diagnosing COVID-19 in the Australian context at that time, but they did recognise that there were certain times and places where they could be usefully employed, and that was around the time when the initial TGA approval of point-of-care testing, so that's as used by a health practitioner and supervised by a health practitioner, came into play. That was revised again substantially on the 11th of August 2021 with updated principles, requirements and recommendations for use as we were in that Delta wave at that time. And again on the 16th of December 2021, particularly then incorporating the changes that Professor Skerritt has already mentioned in relation to the Therapeutic Goods Administration changes on self-administered rapid antigen test use. And then the final one, and this is the current one, in the last week, there's been a further update of that advice, which related to a request from National Cabinet on the 5th of January to update that advice. And I'll quote very specifically here that at this time, so this was the major change that was made in January, at this time, in the context of widespread community transmission, PHLN and CDNA recommend deployment of RATs, a rapid antigen test, to enhance and preserve laboratory-based testing capacity. But all throughout that process, that balance and principles have been constant. And the particular one is in the context of low community transmission, as Australia has been in for the majority of the last 2 years, rapid antigen tests do pose problems in terms of false negative and false positive tests. And that the PCR testing arrangements are and remain the gold standard for diagnosis. So I think it has its place absolutely in the context we're in now. It did not previously have such a place except for very specific places of high risk, such as in aged care facilities, and the Minister has already gone through that in some detail.